Hi everyone, in our last video we looked at the importance of beauty with relation to love, understood as a passion. We saw how beauty begins in sensation that draws us into the depth through our capacity to be moved. Now in this part we'll now look at Aquinas' notion of co-adaptation, which describes the reorientation of our being by a beautiful object. Now to begin with, we must understand desire as the soul's attraction to an object. I see something outside of me that draws my attention and I desire it. Love, by contrast, however, is understood not as the measuring of an object according to my desire, but as an adaptation of my desire to the object. In other words, love is the movement of the object towards the subject. It is a movement in the opposite direction. There is a rearrangement of my own subjective priorities and desires by the beautiful object. Aquinas expresses this in the following manner. He says that although love does not denote the movement of the appetite intending towards the appetible object, yet it denotes that movement whereby the appetite is changed by the appetible object, so as to have complacency therein. This movement impresses a form as well as the movement that results because of this impression. What Aquinas describes as co-adaptation may be understood as the imprint upon the soul of a beautiful object, which readapts it to itself. It reorients desire and thus has an essentially ad intra or receptive character, which distinguishes it from the externally directed acts of the appetite in general, which tend towards goodness in things and take their rest therein. If I see a beautiful woman whom my attention is reoriented and she draws me, this is a description of the first movement of beauty. Here we see the first movement towards a response to a passionless or desireless world, in that with an encounter with the beautiful, which is the form of love, there is an infusion of desire into the soul for the beautiful object, caused by that beautiful object. Aquinas expresses it in the following manner, saying that in the same way the appetible object gives the appetite first a certain adaptation to itself, which consists in complacency in the object, and from this follows movement towards the appetible object. There is here a kind of attunement of one's desire to the beautiful, and adaptation of one to the other. This points to the basic thrust of education, educere, which means to be led out, through which we are led out of ignorance through the intellect's adaptation to the truth. We alter our own location to place oneself in the path of beauty. Now, biblically, the burning bush may be described as an encounter with the beautiful that expresses this exact adaptation, leading to complacency. Moses first must adapt to the encounter. He must attune his being and orientation towards the bush. He must, as the text says, turn aside to see, to appreciate beauty. In other words, adaptation becomes the ground for the revelation of the name and ultimately the revelation of beauty. Perception, which is the basis of beauty, and that in which the soul delights, requires a kind of communion between the body and the world. The philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty states that a sensible that is about to be sensed poses to my body a sort of confused problem. I must find the appropriate attitude that will provide it with the means to become determinate. I must find the response to a poorly formulated question. And yet I only do this in response to its solicitation, the question the beautiful object asks of me. The sensible gives back to me what I had lent to it, but I received it from the sensible in the first place. These words express the reframing of the point of reference from myself according to a sensible or beautiful object. It's the sensible that becomes the center of gravity that situates myself, expressed through the position and attention of my body. In other words, it's the description of what Aquinas describes as co-adaptation. Proust describes a similar encounter when he stares at the face of the girl serving milk at the train station. He says, "I could not take my eyes from her face, which grew larger as she approached, like a sun, which it was somehow possible to stare at, and which was coming nearer and nearer, letting itself be seen at close quarters, dazzling you with its blaze of red and gold. Proust wishes her to remain forever in his perceptual field and will alter his location to bring that about. He says to go with her to the stream, to the cow, to the train, to be always at her side. Elaine Scarry comments that how one walks through the world, the endless small adjustments of balance, is affected by the shifting weights of beautiful things. To summarize, love is the transformation of desire for desirable or beautiful things, which is the principle of every desire we have. The adaptation required to appreciate beauty results in what Aquinas describes as complacencia, in other words, complacency, which means to be pleased in the company of the other. Complacency is built of two elements. First, a recognition that something's good for me. Second, a positive disposition towards it. In other words, it requires not only an intellectual apprehension, but also a voluntary submission. It thus is both a perfect coincidence of reason and will and their correlates, namely truth and goodness. This overlapping of the two is united in the experience of beauty. Hence, we may say that love is oriented towards beauty, which entails the cognitive element through perception rather than the good. Aquinas supports this in the following manner when he states that the beautiful is the same as the good, and they differ in aspect only. For since good is what all seek, the notion of good is that which calms the desire, while the notion of the beautiful is that which calms the desire by being seen or known. Consequently, those senses chiefly regard the beautiful, which are the most cognitive, namely sight and hearing, as ministering to reason. For we speak of beautiful sights and beautiful sounds, but in reference to the other objects of the other senses, we do not often use the expression beautiful, for we do not speak of beautiful tastes and beautiful odors. Thus, it is evident that beauty adds to goodness a relation to the cognitive faculty. So that good means that which simply pleases the appetite, while the beautiful is something that is pleasant to apprehend. The good is that which all things desire, which is appetibility, whereas beauty is oriented not only around appetibility, but apprehensibility. The termination of the good is found in the object, whereas beauty terminates in the soul because of this cognitive dimension. Aquinas summarizes the distinction between the good and the beautiful in the following manner. He says, while the act of appetite terminates in the thing, the act of intellect terminates in the soul. This act which terminates in the soul is that which leads to delight, namely complacency. Now, after looking at the deep relationship between love and beauty, let us now turn to Aquinas' commentary on the effects of love. For Aquinas, there are three effects of love, namely unity, mutual indwelling, and ecstasy. Now, we have briefly gleaned over the first two, namely unity and mutual indwelling, in the deep sensible attraction of the beautiful, which draws one through a recalibration of a desire into deep unity and mutual indwelling through co-adaptation and complacency. Let us now turn to the third effect, namely ecstasy. Ecstasy is a compound word that etymologically means to stand outside oneself. For Aquinas, this occurs to both the apprehensive and appetible powers. One may suffer ecstasy apprehensively when one is either drawn up to discover more knowledge or is overcome by passionate madness. This is love as a disposition, whereas the ecstasy brought about through the appetible power is an effect of love directly, expressed as amor concupiscencia and amor benevolencia. Ecstasy is basically another term for the human person, since the human person is always a being already between being and becoming. He is always stepping outside himself. This implies that the human person is a being who never is who they are, paradoxically. Ecstasy expresses humanity's incompleteness and yearning for the other which is beauty itself. In fact, it evokes surprise, which is a characteristic of authentic beauty, contrasted with dull innovation holding court today. True surprise leads to ecstasy in the sense that it draws one outside of oneself and one's domain of control, hence undermining immanentism. As Schindler comments, it is true that in humankind there is a great yearning and thirst for the beauty with which God has endowed man in creating man and woman. This ecstatic yearning inspired by beauty is expressed through labour, which we will turn to in our next part. Thank you and God bless.